Hello and welcome to the 8th Cod-Past, our 8th podcast thing, for those of you who are not familiar. And indeed, for those of you who are not familiar, this is predominantly designed to catch up with the community and discuss a whole bunch of things that I was not able to discuss in my videos, and also just talk about the future of the plans and whatnot that we have for the channel. I'll be going over some of your comments at first, followed by a brief rundown of our most recent video, which was the Jersey Devil for reference sake, and also then talking about the next couple of weeks that we'll be doing things and all of that stuff. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. We're going to start with a comment by Vinstone69 that says, in Abrahamic texts, where the Leviathan comes from, it was one of God's greatest creations. The beast was so large and powerful that God had to physically come down to earth and snap its neck to kill it. Why did he kill it? Because the beast and its mate was rapidly multiplying and would even take over the entire world in months. It's all good though, God used its flesh and meat to feed people. That's a very interesting idea there, Vlinstone69. Sorry, I'm terrible at some of these names, they're quite difficult to pronounce. Well, I think that a lot of Catholic people would take issue with the fact that you mention that God physically comes down to earth, because technically I think, especially since this is an Abrahamic religion, God is supposed to be omnipresent. Therefore, he cannot actually do that, but I get what you mean. God had to directly intervene in the destruction of this creature. And that's a very interesting idea. I'm not quite familiar with the Leviathan as such. To that extent, to know exactly what God had done to it. But what you're speaking of sounds very much like the behemoth, rather, instead of the Leviathan, because behemoth is smote at the end of the Bible, and people do eat it. It's quite odd. Things get a bit weird right at the end there. I mean, it's all metaphor and stuff. How else do you explain the end of the world? So, yeah. Moving on, next we have more on the Leviathan video. The Truth Reigns Forever saying that he has a hunch that some lost ships are accredited to sea monsters, vis-a-vis the Leviathan. That's actually very interesting. Obviously, we've always had a sea monster ship-destroying kind of thing in our culture. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea being a very good example of this, where a giant Architeuthis squid is supposedly attacking the Nautilus, the ship that, well, the submarine that goes along under the ocean there. After that, I do think that Architeuthis was blamed for a lot of things, a lot of hypothetical ships getting pulled under the ocean and stuff like that. Indeed, even the Bermuda Triangle. Interestingly enough, I do recall a video game a couple of years back that suggested that methane hydrate was responsible for ships and planes sinking in the ocean around Bermuda. What was it? I think it was... it was a spin-off of Tekken, where you play as the assassin lady. Okay, well, I can't remember her name. It'll probably come to me as I'm saying this. Anyway, so what methane hydrate is, it's basically ice that has formed a lattice in its creation, in its formation, and has trapped methane. This is particularly interesting because it basically results in, well, ice that you can burn like a candle. And when the methane is released from this ice, so the theory goes, it creates bubbles that then rise to the surface. Now, anybody that knows anything about surface tension and how boats work and whatnot will know that when you introduce bubbles and an unstable surface like that, things tend to sink. So a huge release of this methane hydrate was supposedly the cause of a lot of ships sinking in the Bermuda Triangle. And yeah, that's pretty cool. It would also then affect airplanes low-flying airplanes by disrupting the air currents around it. If ever you've experienced turbulence, imagine that. I think even now the statistics still hold that turbulence has never brought a plane down, but, you know, hypothetically, if it was incredibly strong turbulence, you know, I guess maybe it could, but I'm not 100% clued up on aerodynamics to be able to comment fully on that. Either way, that was a bit of a ramble. I hope you enjoyed. Next we have Keeper Plus, continuing on our Leviathan video discussion, saying that I lost him when I mentioned evolution, a theory that a man invented who didn't even believe his own theory, obviously in reference to Darwin there. Fair play, I'll say. Personally, I don't take to any one side in any of these discussions. I will say, however, as I mentioned in the rules for reification video, that we do follow the laws of thermodynamics in the reification section. The myth section is more for the, the more metaphorical sense of the creature. In fact, that's really how you can break down these videos. The myth discusses the creature as you would hear it, in an everyday kind of setting, and sort of summarizes what the creature is, and I use that as a starting point to then build off of. Then obviously we have what I've now called the history section, where we discuss how the culture has interacted with the creature and changed it over the ages or decades, etc., since it was created. And then finally the reification section, which focuses entirely on our understanding of physics and how it relates to the creature. So I do hope that everybody keeps this in mind when watching the videos, that it's kind of a rule, and it's already set out in that way. Interestingly enough, since you mentioned that, it sort of from a physical perspective, evolution is actually a very interesting phenomena. You see, in any kind of energy system, the system tends to get more and more complex as time goes on. And DNA is, as far as we can tell at this point in history, DNA is something that we call a dissipating structure. That means that it's a structure that formed as a result of a high energy valence in a system, and then it reduces the energy valence in that system. Examples of this include things like snowflakes. It's a very complicated structure that comes from a weird temperature in the air. Not a weird temperature. The temperature in the air is sitting at a particularly weird point where it needs to dissipate quite rapidly, but has no outlet at that time except for the rain. So what happens is that the snowflake will then form, and that structure is really, really good at getting rid of energy. You also see this with things like hurricanes and whirlpools, etc. So what happens then is that if you've got enough energy in a system, usually as a result of some kind of liquid gathering energy vis-a-vis water. Why did I say vis-a-vis? Okay, well anyway, as a result of something like water, you end up developing these interesting amino acids and proteins that eventually become DNA. Then, after a while, the DNA structure gets more and more complex and more efficient at, getting rid of energy in a system. I can think of quite a few examples of this, but let me start with a very abstract example, just to give you a general idea of what I mean, and then I'll go into a more real example. Okay, so during the Carboniferous period, we see a lot of trees starting to exist in the world. But at the time, there was no bacteria to break this material down. So the trees would collapse and fall on top of each other and then eventually become rock. This rock is what we know today as coal, and it also adds to the oil, etc., etc. Now, this energy is trapped in the ground, and you can probably see where I'm going with this. The energy is trapped in the ground, so nature creates a more complicated structure to reduce the energy valence, in this case human beings. We mine up the oil and the coal, etc., and we reduce the energy valence of the coal by burning it. Now, of course, this example is very abstract, and in all due honesty, it's kind of not exactly how the thing works, but I hope that for those of you who are having a bit of difficulty understanding the idea, you can sort of summarize it like that. In truth, this actually acts more like spreading energy around. So, energy from the sun will come to the earth and it sort of gets trapped. DNA and other structures take that energy and form things like plants and animals. And as the plants and animals are interacting with each other and interacting with the environment, they spread the energy around. So basically, you go eat a steak and you increase the energy in your body, and then you go and have a run, and you spread the energy around the system, the environment, through sweating and through all the work that you're doing, turning it into noise and all sorts of stuff, and you've effectively reduced the energy valence of the steak and of the environment at large. You've spread the energy around. So, yeah, that's, as you get DNA, as DNA gets more complicated, it's more efficient at spreading energy. That's the theory, at least for now. That was quite a ramble. Good grief, it looks like I'm on a roll today. Next, we have Keeper Plus saying again, he thinks dinosaurs were Leviathan. Obviously, I assume then we're taking a look at the young Earth theory in this case from your perspective. Do correct me if I'm wrong. In which case, what dinosaur would the Leviathan have been? Immediately as a result of Jurassic World, the most recent films, I think of the Mosasaurus, because that would be quite scary and would eat a human being whole. But there's also the Liopleurodon, or Leopleurodon. I'm sure it's pronounced Liopleurodon, but yeah. The Liopleurodon was on average about 10 feet bigger, longer, than the Mosasaur. And it lived during the Jurassic period, if I recall correctly. It was basically a giant mouth that swam through the water. It was absolutely horrifying. Do look it up. I'll pull up a picture here for you guys to see. It's actually, there was a documentary. Well, not a documentary, a docudrama that was done on dinosaurs. Hang on, I'm going to cut here and take a look. Okay, Walking with Dinosaurs, yay, that discusses it. There's one that, I quite enjoyed this, I don't know why I forgot the name, but this was a very fun series. I highly recommend it to everyone. Anyway, one of the episodes discusses the Jurassic period, so I highly recommend you guys take a look. Next, for the Phoenix video, we have Michelle Sayers. Never judge what you know nothing about. Don't judge unless you be judged in return. Warning. I'm taking some creative liberties there with how Michelle wrote things, and I think that's a good rule to live by. I'm not entirely sure what it has to do with the Phoenix, but I guess the idea of rebirth and facing up to the consequences that you have to, face up to, how could I explain? You sort of have to, you can't escape the consequences of your actions. You'll always be having to face them, I guess. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret this, but thank you for the post. And next, Michelle Sayers goes on to say that maybe it is an example of truth. The Phoenix, that is. Well, that is a very interesting idea. Insofar as that, truth, you can never kill the truth. You can bury it, you can try and hide it, you can even try to destroy it, as in the case of the Phoenix, but it will always come out. And, that's a very interesting metaphor, especially considering the revolution and other things that I mentioned in the Phoenix video. Next we have Tusk Bilasimo saying, Phoenix dactyphalaria, commonly known as the date palm. The saying, from the ashes rises the phoenix, likely originates from burning palm fronds to produce ashes that would be used to build the pyramids. There is now good evidence that the limestone blocks used in their early construction, including those at Giza, were not carved but cast from re-amalgamated limestone. Ashes from burnt palm fronds have been suggested as a key ingredient in forming geopolymer re-amalgamated limestone. Hence the saying, from the ashes rises the phoenix. That's actually a very, very interesting point there. And then he goes on to give us something to look at, saying Joseph Davidis of the Geopolymer Institute mentions this, saying that there's also a good YouTube video of him. Very interesting idea. I'd never heard of this before, but it does make sense to a certain degree, especially since you say the date palm. Well, I wonder if there's not perhaps a tradition somewhere in the world of some cultural group burning date palms to actually get a hold of the dates. And dates are quite oily, so maybe... Well, anyway, I'll look it up. Next we have Curestruck saying, thanks for the upload. My 6-year-old son's name is Phoenix, so this was really cool video to show him. I'm really glad that I can help you there, sir. It's not every day that I hear of somebody called Phoenix. I am familiar with the town of Phoenix in Texas, or city of Phoenix. I'm not entirely sure exactly what it is, but I am familiar with it. So I'm not surprised to see that even people share the same name. I had always thought that it was sort of like an action hero kind of name, so yeah, that's pretty cool. I hope your son lives up to that name. Next on the Beastiary by Praetorian Rex, saying that I missed an opportunity in this video. I could have used a clip of Rita Repulsa shouting, "Make my monster grow." For those of you who don't know, Rita Repulsa is a character from the Power Rangers, the original Power Rangers series. Well, yeah, needless to say, this was something that I probably should have done, but it is not really in keeping with the aesthetic of my videos, so it's a bit of a coin toss whether I should have done that or not. Just to expand a little bit on the Rita Repulsa thing, basically in every Power Rangers episode, the Power Rangers would fight a whole bunch of like smaller minions that were called putty people, and then they would fight a monster that was created by Rita Repulsa, usually using some kind of clay or something. The monster then would inevitably lose to the Power Rangers, and then she would say, "Make my monster grow," and do something I can't rightly recall right now, but do something to the monster, and they would grow to the size of a building, and then the Power Rangers would have to put their giant robots together into an even bigger robot so that they could kill the new monster. I don't actually recall the Power Rangers ever using the basic robots, the basic Zords, to fight anything. They only ever used the Megazord outside of that one movie. I think it was Power Rangers Turbo. They used the Zords on their own. Yeah, either way, thank you for the idea, Praetorian. Next, we have Sapphire Wolf discussing the werewolf video, saying that they forgot to ask if there would be a way for me to do a video on the Minotaur. They love the way that I organize my videos, and I should continue making them. Well, I will certainly add the Minotaur to the list. I imagine that it would not be too different from the Centaur, but it might be more interesting from a mythological perspective to discuss it, rather than a reification perspective in this case. Another werewolf thing, but the topic is not really about the werewolf, saying that vampires are real monsters. Werewolves are just a convenient scapegoat. Well, that's a very interesting thought. I'm not surprised that I would hear this, especially considering that a lot of the myths and legends around werewolves and vampires have now become so intrinsically connected, and that the relationship has become equally connected. What was it? Underworld originally... No, it wasn't Underworld that originally did that. There was something before, but the Underworld series of movies brought the idea of vampires and werewolves fighting one another to the forefront. Vampires being the masters and werewolves being the slaves. I'm not sure why they chose to do that, but that was a thing that happened, so there you go. Actually, it was in Van Helsing as well, wasn't it? And I used Van Helsing clips in my werewolf video. Yes, I did. This is actually a very, very interesting thing. I should probably look it up. Presently, I have not actually seen anything as to the origin of how this myth is connected, but if anyone knows, please let me know. I'd be very interested to learn more about it. Next, we have Darth Dude Sith saying that the Underworld movies are awesome. There we go. And my favorite of all of the vampire, werewolf legends, myths, lore stories. Love both versions of Being Human as well. A very interesting thing is that the director of the Underworld stories actually has a degree in genetic engineering. Now, far be it from me to criticize the man, but he didn't really take into account something that I frequently mention, which is the thermodynamics. He has the werewolves transforming so quickly, it's absolutely ridiculous. But he did generally get the overall mechanics correct, as far as I can tell. I mean, I haven't really watched the movies in quite a while, but, there you go. Even for finding clips from these movies, I don't really get to go and watch through them. I sort of remember vague scenes that I want to find, and then I'll track through the film and go, there it is, and see if I can extract the clip or not. But yeah, that's a very interesting thing. So there we go, at least a person trained in genetic engineering made movies about vampires and werewolves. How's that for you? Next, we have a bit of a discussion with myself and Praetorian Rex on the zombie video, saying that they were watching 8-Bit Ryan's playlist of Dying Light, and they can't help but think of the special types of zombies, especially ones called volatiles, and what do I think of such creatures. I did reply that it's reasonable for zombies to be combustive in nature due to gases building up in them. But I must confess, I had done this reply, I'd committed this reply before actually knowing exactly what was going on in Dying Light, and I had just made an assumption based on the name, volatile, thinking that it meant explosively potent. It turns out that they are in fact just a really strong super zombie that's very hard to kill. I am still trying to get through a bit more of a playthrough through Dying Light myself, but when I have done that, I might get back to yourself, Praetorin, and I'll get back to anybody else who's curious on the topic. But if anybody does have any ideas of how zombies could become volatiles, well, go on, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Another comment on the zombie video by Xavier Vaz, saying that he studies mythology and that I'm his professor. Well, thank you, very kind words, but I'm certainly not any professor of any kind. I just have a wide variety of interests, and well, like most people, I have a wide variety of interests. I think that I'm not particularly special, which is why I do insist that other people also engage in the reification aspect of my videos. I put in a little bit of effort to make videos for people to enjoy, but I think that other people would enjoy these kinds of discussions, therefore, making them. So, Xavier, please, if you have any ideas, share them. I'm certainly not a professor of any kind, so do remember that, everybody. I don't think that I'm deserving of that kind of title, but again, I appreciate the sentiment. Next, Praetorin Rex once more, saying about the basilisk, how much bodily resources are needed to produce venom, like I mentioned. And this is a very good question. In fact, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, this was something that I had looked up, and I couldn't remember the exact data at the time, but I thought I would go around and, just get a bit more information to answer Praetorin Rex a bit more accurately. In looking this up again, I have found that there has been more information brought to light in recent years, or at least in recent years I have had access to things that have slightly different bits of information. This would indicate that it doesn't require as much energy as I previously thought to produce venom. However, it is still quite a lot of energy. I will add it to my budget for the videos this following month to take a look at the reports and the studies that discuss the exact amount of energy required to produce various kinds of venom. The toxicology journals, unfortunately, are a little bit pricey, at least pricey for my tastes, so put a pin in this one. Don't let me forget about it, and I will get back to you, sir. But again, if anybody does know the exact numbers, do let me know. Next, on the basilisk as well, we have Jennifer McLean saying that when the plasma center of our solar system appears to open its eye, a plasma snake will emerge. Anybody who sees it dies, although the reflection, a la Harry Potter, should reduce the risk. In this case, I'm assuming that by plasma you're referring to the sun, and specifically you're referring to solar flares and other jets of material that might be ejected from the sun, which is, well, yeah, I guess it would be very dangerous if we look at the reflections of the solar flares and other things that are ejected from the sun. It is very pretty. This is part of what causes the northern lights to flare. But on the other hand, if we're exposed to an incredibly strong solar flare, we will die. We will be turned to ash or stone. Well, okay, not really. We'll just get a huge amount of radiation and die from, well, burns, etc. But how you interpret that as stone or ash is up to you, I guess. So, very interesting. And again, the reason I think that she or he is referring to the sun as the plasma center of our solar system is because, as we all know, plasma is partially ionized gas. That is to say, it has had its electrons stripped of it by introducing a large amount of energy into the system. In fact, if you look at a fire, the actual flame portion of the fire is this partially ionized gas. In the sun, I think it's actually fully ionized, but it's much of a muchness at this point. Very interesting, and it certainly does look like snakes. After that, we have Sapphire Wolf discussing the vampire. What about a slowed down metabolism? Would that slow down aging and possibly create less need for blood? And that's a very interesting point. I had not thought of this before. Trying to change the metabolism from a mammalian metabolism into a reptilian metabolism, something cold-blooded, is a very interesting idea. I did have further discussions with Sapphire Wolf after he posted this, but I don't have them up on the screen right now. Basically, I did mention that it is possible for creatures, after Sapphire Wolf encouraged me, I did mention it's possible for creatures to sort of create a kind of pseudo-warm-bloodedness without actually being warm-blooded. Because the big problem here is that we generally consider the vampire to be some kind of predator. Now, whilst predators can be cold-blooded, the active, super-fast healing, scary monster that we think the vampire is kind of not like this in any way. While it would make sense that the vampire is more of a cold-blooded, kind of parasitic predator, I think that if we want to keep it in line with our myths, we sort of have to make some kind of compensation here. So, Sapphire Wolf did mention that, I think it was Komodo dragons or something along those lines, that can create a sort of warm-blooded effect. I'm most familiar, however, with great white sharks. Great white sharks are very interesting animals. Most sharks, and most fish in fact, are cold-blooded animals. But great whites have overcome this disability, if you will, by having very large dorsal tail muscles. And these muscles are mostly used for moving through the ocean. But they have, well, two changes. Those large muscles, for one thing, they're bigger than an average shark's, and they're more towards the center of the shark. This prevents the heat generated by the muscles from escaping into the ocean, because remember, water is a very, very quick way to get rid of energy. The shark then keeps the heat generated by the muscles circulating within the body by having a rather complicated system of blood flow patterns going throughout its body. And this creates a sort of higher internal temperature in the shark than we see in the oceans, allowing it to do things like breach and swim really bloody quickly, which makes it a very interesting animal. And it does this all the while without actually being able to have metabolic generation of heat. Is relying exclusively on those muscles. So very interesting. And I guess we could do the same with the vampire, but this would require a lot of restructuring of the human body. So maybe this could happen over a series of centuries, which, it goes from, a vampire would then go from a normal looking human to something like that Nosferatu kind of vampire, perhaps. We would have to do a lot of thinking and tinkering around with it, but there you go. That's a general rundown of the idea. I would like to explore it a little bit more, but I need to think about it. So if anybody else listening to this has any ideas, please share it with me, and mention it to Sapphire Wolf if you can find his post in the video. Next we have Top 10, saying, I like to think that vampires are as very powerful creatures, like in Hellsing and Castlevania, or even D&D. I think about them as the kings of monsters. I might like them, but honestly I don't believe that they exist, and I'm not the type of person that believes on cryptids or stuff. And I like them, but deep in my heart I don't believe in them, and even if they exist, they will probably be very different than I expect them to be. By the way, great video. I would really like it if you guys made another one about vampires. Well, with all the information and with the popularity of the vampire, I think that we are due a bit of an addendum, so I will get more onto that if time allows. But for now, I also quite enjoyed Hellsing and Castlevania, however, not necessarily for the vampire's power. I mostly enjoyed it for the sort of the atmosphere. If we're talking about the original animated series of Hellsing, not the current OVA that is being produced, but the one that deviated from the original manga, I really, really enjoyed that one up until about the third episode, because I was thinking that it would be very interesting to see how Ceres ultimately adapts to having to be a vampire, and you see her going through this process predominantly in the second episode, but it sort of falls short at some point, and it becomes about Alucard killing all sorts of random baddies. Not to say that this is inherently bad, but I discovered Hellsing at an age where that kind of thing didn't really appeal to me, and even now, although I do see how fun it can be and quite enjoy the OVA, I'm not too keen on the on the lack of focus on this atmosphere. I really appreciated the atmosphere, and that was my main drawing point to the Hellsing series. However, it's still quite a fun romp to see Alucard pulling people apart and also fighting Paladin Anderson, so there we go. In fact, probably in the OVA series, that is one of the coolest things to happen, the fight with Paladin Anderson. It makes absolutely no sense. Sorry, grammar. It makes absolutely no sense, but wow, that was something to watch. I highly recommend it. Another question by Praetorian Rex on my Dragon video saying, can I make a suggestion or two, please? And yes, everybody, you are welcome to make suggestions at any time. Next we have Paloa 23 year on the Unicorn video saying, so, unicorns only come forth to virgin women? I'm confused. Is it because they trust them, or is it mostly because of the smell? I did reply quite at length to Paloa here, saying that it is possible for a unicorn to be attracted to the smell of a woman at various points. Obviously, we're having to discuss the changes in hormones, because this is the only thing that would indicate whether someone is a virgin or not, since that is an essential part of the myth. And, well, what you see when a woman gets pregnant is that the progesterone and estrogen levels in her body start to increase quite a lot. And then after the pregnancy terminates, it immediately cuts out. It's a very dramatic hormonal change. And moreover, during menstruation, just before menstruation, you see the progesterone levels increasing as well as the estrogen levels, though to a lesser degree. So I would imagine that the unicorn is actually able to detect some kind of interaction between the estrogen and progesterone. Ultimately, you will need to do some kind of linear programming chart to figure out exactly the sweet spot in which a woman's hormones would fit the requirements of the unicorn legend. But I imagine that ultimately, when a woman has just come off of the menstrual cycle, the menstruation part of the menstrual cycle, and is entering the fertile part, where alongside luteinizing hormone you see a spike of testosterone, I imagine at that point the unicorn might be less prone to attacking the woman, probably because of that. A friend of mine, Kirk Smith, yes, Michael, I met him a while ago in Romania, and he was the researcher who did a lot of, who did the initial inquiries into how pheromones affect human beings. At the time when he was originally doing this research, he mentioned that we thought human beings were a little bit too complicated to be affected by things such as smell to that extent, but he found that women were attracted to the male hormone called androsterone. And he did this by basically placing women in a dentist's office and marking a few chairs with this hormone that he obtained from boar saliva. The women who were no longer innocent, who were no longer virgins, were attracted to the androsterone, whereas women who were still virgins were not attracted to androsterone and did not did not sit on those chairs, did not prefer to sit on those chairs. Importantly here was that the androsterone was not something that women were inherently attracted to. Rather, it was a learned reaction from having sex with men. So basically, a woman who has had sufficient sexual encounters with men would associate unconsciously the smell of androsterone with just a general form of attraction. So I wonder if it's not perhaps some kind of more subtle chemical that changes within the woman's body as well after she gets pregnant or after a few sexual encounters. But we would actually need to do proper hardcore research to figure this out. So, yeah, your question, though simple, is actually got a very complicated answer. I'm sorry. Next we have Young Money on the witch video, saying, isn't there a male connotation of the witch called a warlock? In this case, I assume that you mean, isn't there a male version of the witch? In which case, yeah, there is a male version called a warlock, but as far as I understand, the term witch is used interchangeably through cultures up until a certain point. Specifically English-speaking cultures, I should say. Up until about sort of the date escapes me. Around the time of the... just after the Inquisition, so around the time of the Italian Renaissance and whatnot. No. Even later than that, even later. Probably the 1800s, we see the term witch. No, that's even incorrect. Sorry that you're having to listen to my thought process going all haywire. But I would say, just to be safe, let's say the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see the term witch being associated mostly with women, whereas prior to that, the term witch was both men and women. Think of things like Shakespeare and The Crucible. Now, The Crucible was written in the 1950s, if I recall, the play The Crucible. But if you recall, this is using the old term of witch, appropriate for the time in which the story takes place, to talk about, the sort of moral panics and Proctor... what was his name? The protagonist who ultimately gets hanged. He was accused of being a witch, despite being a man. And this was in sort of the founding times of America, is the setting. So, do remember that. Sorry, my memory's failing me for a lot of these things. I probably should make some kind of edits to this, but these tend to be very long, and making these small corrections, if anybody can notice them, please pop them down in the comments. I know it seems very lazy, but good grief, my mind is running at 120 miles an hour when I'm reading these things. It's difficult for me to put words together sometimes. Anyway, moving on. We have Tasty G Master 2099 saying that they look up from reading Mage the Ascension. Magic is just energy manipulation. Sounds like some technocratic propaganda to me. Now, for real though, always nice to see a Beastiary video to grace my sub box. You're very welcome, sir. I hope that you enjoyed it. And actually, a lot of magic in sort of cultural terms has been explained as some kind of science. But I don't know why I forgot the word science there. But there you go. A lot of the time it's done in a way that is sort of half-hearted. Think of the recent live-action version of The Magician's Apprentice. And, he explains to... Nicolas Cage explains to the boy, oh, this works by increasing barometric pressure around the object that we need to find, and that will cause a storm to appear. And then they look over there in the distance and see, oh, there's a storm appearing. Without actually explaining how does it increase barometric pressure? What is the connection between what you're doing, the object, and the atmospheric pressure around the object? It's... it's sort of a half-hearted kind of magical explanation. So I wanted to take it one step further with this video, and it was a little bit tricky. And even now, I'm still not very happy with the witch video. I really think that this is explaining this in any kind of logical way is, at least for the time being, beyond the capacity of a reification video, Beastiary reification portion. I will probably have to have a bit of a live stream or something and actually talk to you guys so we can suss this out and, really go hardcore on all of the little details. So, yeah. Next we have Marina Ravenberg. I loved, as an occultist, the technological perspective or take on magic, but it is wrong nevertheless. The theory is flawed and someone like me is proof of that. And then he goes on to share a link to his website. He says that the only aspect that he found that was at fault was handling of such energy from a higher being is possible, as well as not being able to generate energy as an individual. For the rest, it describes the process of magic quite well. if you're willing to share how magic works, please go ahead. I'm always interested to hear new ideas. And in fact, just from mentioning the lowered metabolism of the vampire earlier, I came up with an entirely new idea of how to construct a vampire, completely otherwise from what I had mentioned in the original video. So every time you guys mention something, it gives me new ideas, and it will give other people new ideas as well. So don't hesitate to just let it all loose, as it were. Next we have Batman Collector on the Behemoth video. That's not much of a Batman to collect, but there you go. He didn't know elephants had tails like cedars. Well, they don't, but this is this is an exaggeration of the creature. You must remember, especially with all kinds of biblical texts, any Abrahamic religion has had the texts translated and reinterpreted across generations. Now, you can go back and you can read Latin Bibles. You can go even further back and read Aramaic Bibles and the various original documents. Not that I think that you can get your hands on them. I think they're mostly held by the Vatican right now, and even then, if they're not destroyed. Now, what this does is it creates a small problem with translations like this, and this is especially noticeable within Christian culture. Less to a degree in Jewish and to a lesser degree in Jewish and Islamic culture, but really a huge amount in Christian culture, because Christianity has been, translated up the wazoo. There are 2.5 billion members in various forms of Christianity, so such is to be expected. And then when we get to adjectives, like the cedar-like tail, it becomes weird. Does this mean that the tail is as large as cedar? Does this mean it has the texture of cedar? Does it mean it has the color of cedar? It's difficult to know. So yeah, make of that what you will. I imagine that I made a lot of enemies with that statement, but with that series of explanations about religious texts, but, it's generally the truth. Next we have Damien Wielden again, on mermaids. So we know mermaids can make human men fall in love with them, but can mermen make human women fall in love with them in some way, in the same way that mermaids do with men? This is a very interesting question. And when I originally replied to Damien, it's actually a very long reply. If you guys are interested, do take a look at the mermaid video and give it a bit of a look. But in general, the way women compute and process sound is very different from the way men compute and process sound. This is also true for emotions. You see, the thalamus is the main area where emotions are processed in men and in young children. So both girls and boys process emotion in the thalamus, and men process emotion in the thalamus. However, as women age, as girls get older, the locus of where emotion is processed moves up the brain into the neocortex and partially into the parietal lobe or parietal lobe, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This is part of the reason why you see women often complain about men's inability to communicate emotion, because the parts of your brain that are actually responsible for communication and cognitive thought is, located in the neocortex, which is also where women are processing emotion. Men, however, have to somehow try to connect a very old, and indeed, if for the sake of poetry, a reptilian part of the brain up to the neocortex and try and explain what's going on over there. It's not very easy, to say the least. Naturally, this also leads to differences in sexuality. I mention sexuality, or at least attraction, because, that's kind of the idea behind the mermaid. So, when the mermaid is singing, I imagine what is happening is that it's activating the thalamus in, men, because that is where emotion is being processed. And because men have a less direct access to their emotions, cognitively speaking, than women do, they're more susceptible to the mermaid. However, because women have a little bit more conscious access to their emotions, they might be able to break it apart a little bit more and be able to resist. However, children, both boys and girls, would be equally affected as men are. which can get a little bit creepy depending on how you look at it. Well, again, the myth is quite a lot to unpack. I'm not entirely sure what I'm saying here, but I hope that makes sense, generally speaking. Also, another interesting thing is that females are more responsive to music than men. In a study done in, I think, 1999, I'll try and link it up here. I did mention it in my reply to Damien. Girls were discovered to have been more responsive to singing than boys. Particularly, premature babies were sung to in order to see the effects that the singing would have on them. Girls that were sung to were released up to 12 days earlier from the maternity ward than girls who were not sung to. However, boys were absolutely not responsive at all. So obviously there is a difference in the way that females and males, experience music from the day that you're born, and this might lead to the differences that we see in the Siren's song. But obviously, men are attracted to women who can sing, so there you go. That's, we don't need to abstract, we can just look at it directly at what it is. So, yeah. Next we have Praetorian Rex about the rules for reification, and saying, so, no sharks jumping out of toilets then? To which my only reply is, if you have a big enough toilet. After that, Damien wheeled in again in the discussion that brought about what we're going to talk about next. He asked me if I would create a Jersey Devil video and a video on maybe the Kraken or Leviathan, and he also then mentioned Hellhounds, specifically for the Halloween month, that is October. I misread this and thought that he was asking for me to release the Jersey Devil on October 2nd. So I dropped everything that I was doing, and that gave rise to the Jersey Devil video. So I'm sorry everybody that was looking forward to other videos, but I thought, okay, well, this is a really good idea. Let me make sure that I get the Halloween stuff going, and everybody can enjoy that. And yet here I am, feeling like a bit of an idiot. He just said he meant somewhere in October, but yeah. So either way, that's pretty much that for the comments. That was a very long rant, and I hope everybody had a fun time. Moving on to the Jersey Devil video. The Jersey Devil video was very, very interesting. The information, as you saw it, I'm sure, was quite readily available, and we can actually trace, unlike with a lot of other creatures, the origins of this creature, which let you sort of see how it goes from this name-calling situation into an actual full-blown creature. And I ended on the idea that perhaps a lot of the creatures that we see in myth also came from some kind of name-calling or some other thing like that eventually turned into some magical creature, which is very, very, very interesting, needless to say. Who was the mermaid? Who was the werewolf, the vampire, and what have you? It's really a unique story, a very interesting look into myths and legends as a result of that. Obviously, we can learn how should I say? Obviously, we can take a lot of lessons from this, but I didn't go into too much detail about that in the video. The video, in fact, could have been very, very, very long, to be perfectly honest. Not so much with the myth section or the history section, but with the reification section. Going through all of those mutations and deformities and, everything that's connected to that, honestly nearly turned into a 50-minute long video, and that still would not have been enough. I will probably need to have a sit down during a stream or something and then just blather on everything that I learned and everything that I had dug up and all of the data that I'd found, just to explain exactly how the Jersey Devil might exist, but also again why it is statistically impossible. Again, these things were generally covered in the video, but just the extent to what we can look at them, it was really, 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 really interesting. And I definitely wanted to avoid viruses and things like that during this video. Things like, for example, the Zika virus, just to put you in mind of diseases that can mutate children. Because, I'd mentioned viruses and all that with zombies and vampires, etc., etc., etc. So I really wanted to avoid it. But we can even go into things like that and really have a bit of a ball discussing how these things might exist. The Jersey Devil, for the most part, was actually kind of interesting, to be honest, simply because I had never done anything like that before this, and the Jersey Devil itself is... It's not a myth, but it is a cryptid, and it exists in the same places the Yeti does and the Chupacabra, more recent myths, where it's a legend that is produced by the modern world and therefore affects the modern world in a completely different way than the vampires or unicorns would. Where the vampires and unicorns, we have to adapt them to what we understand today. The Jersey Devil and Chupacabra are already existing in the world as it is now, more or less. So I really did have quite a lot of fun. And yeah, it was quite shocking to discover that it was ultimately a tragedy. And I really cannot emphasize that enough. This is a very tragic story. I dedicated an entire paragraph to it in the history section. But I really want to emphasize it that this was political rivalry. This was a man and a family at large who were being teased and being rejected from the society in which they lived in, and then ultimately literally turning into these monsters. Okay, well, not literally, but literally turning into the monsters, because their family did eventually give birth to the monster in legend. In actuality, in the actual legend thing, this is a very weird description, but also metaphorically turning into the monsters. It's a very interesting and very odd position for them to exist in. But I really wanted to emphasize that the Jersey Devil is really a story about tragedy, and it's actually not a monster. It's a human being who just happened to kind of look funny. As for where it got this aggressive behavior, I guess that we can attribute that to the social rejection and isolation that somebody so horribly deformed would experience. Think of Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or the retroactively applied backstory to Jason in Friday the 13th. You know, these kinds of things where a child is deformed and separated as a result of that deformity, causing them to sort of have a monstrous outburst, is quite interesting. And we end up with sort of two versions of this, where we have the Leatherface version, or the Jason version, and then the Quasimodo version from Hunchback of Notre Dame fame, where Quasimodo, his name meaning literally improperly formed or half-formed, is locked away in a tower for nobody to actually take a look at him and interact with him in any meaningful way, but he ends up being a hero of a story. Frankenstein's Adam, the actual monster, is very similar to this. If anybody has any idea of what they would like to see with a further exploration of the Jersey Devil and the various things that are surrounding it, please let me know. And please let me know your ideas about the Jersey Devil as well, if you haven't already in the Jersey Devil video. And, well, yeah, that's pretty much that for the Jersey Devil video. As for future stuff on the channel and videos, my next plan is to follow up what Damien said and try to create a video on the... what was it, the Hellhounds or Cerberus, simply to follow the idea of the Halloween time kind of stuff. The Griffin video has been completed, for those of you who are wondering. It is there sitting on my hard drive, and I'm patting my computer now just very gently because I don't want it to be picked up by the microphone, but it is there. It is waiting for people to watch it. Just, I think that it would be more thematic with the month to stick with Damien's suggestions. Odd name, Damien, especially considering the connection with, what was that story? Gosh, what was it? The Hellboy. The boy who's born as the devil. I forgot its name now, but his name was Damien. He's the son of the devil. He's got like the little 666. The Omen, that's what it was, The Omen. So yes, Damien recommending Halloween stuff with your name so connected to The Omen. Anyway, so yeah, that's the plan. I'm going to try and release the Cerberus video or the Hellhound video. I'm not entirely sure at this point how it's going to end up. I have written the outline for it, and I will probably have it done for Halloween. But for now, it's going to sit in a bit of a stasis, and we'll see. Well, it's not going to sit in stasis. The Griffin's going to sit in stasis, and the Hellhound Cerberus video will take priority over that. But at least you know that the things that you want are waiting there for you. So, yeah. Anyway, with that, this was a very, very, very quick and weird ramble through a whole bunch of stuff. I hope that this made sense, and I hope that nobody took too much offense. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll hear from you next time.